Good evening, everyone. My name is David Van Zandt. I'm the president here at the New School, and I want to welcome everyone to the keynote address for the Conference on Human Rights in the Global Economy. I'm going to start out by asking our Dean of the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy, Nehal Bhuta, to say a few words. Nehal?
Thank you, David. Thank you, David, and welcome to everybody. You may want to come down further, but whatever makes you feel comfortable.
Great seats down in the front, yeah. Mm-hmm.
This conference is the 25th in the Social Research Conference series, and it also celebrates the 10th anniversary of our graduate program in international affairs at the New School. I want to make just some brief remarks because we have more important things to do than listen to me. But this is a third in the series of annual symposia on the practices of human rights. The interdisciplinary conversations about human rights in society, politics, and the economy is one of the areas that the New School faculty from across the different divisions are interested in. And we're becoming a leading institution specializing in this field. This conference has been organized to enable experts and scholars to discuss human rights as a mediating language for dialogue about social justice and the global economy. Rousseau's gift of the notion of human rights, reinforced by our nation's founding documents, are at the heart of a liberal conception of this nation. Human rights are often conceived as inalienable rights of individuals, such as liberty, security, and freedom of speech, where the word inalienable hides a multitude of philosophical issues. Notions of social justice based on human rights speak to institutional structures and how they shape mutual engagement, including the global economy. What responsibilities do wealthy nations have, and in particular, what ought they do to alleviate global poverty? How can their assistance be mutually beneficial? What are the human rights responsibilities and obligations of international financial institutions and corporations? What are the opportunities for economic policies and institutions to strengthen human rights policies around the world, thereby enhancing social justice? The conference series was launched in 1988 by Arien Mack, Alfred and Monette Marrow Professor of Psychology and editor of Social Research and International Quarterly. She also directs the Center for Public Scholarship at the New School. Indeed, papers from this conference will be published in a special issue of Social Research in fall 2012, which you can order from the journal table in the lobby. Professor Mack collaborated with several New School faculty on this conference, and I would like to recognize them. Nehal Bhuta, who is Assistant Professor of International Affairs at the Milano School, Sakiko Fukuda-Parr, Professor of International Affairs at the Milano School, and Miriam Ticktin, Assistant Professor of Anthropology, the New School for Social Research, and Eugene College at the New School for Liberal Arts. The conference, like all of its predecessors, would not have been possible without generous support. We are deeply grateful to the Climate Change, Narratives, Rights, and Poor project at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, Norway. Contributions were also made by the Center for Public Scholarship, the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy, and the Executive Dean's Office at the New School for Public Engagement. Now, I would like to welcome back David Van Zandt to the podium. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nehal. It's now my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Olivier De Schutter, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Mr. De Schutter will discuss the role of human rights in shaping international regimes. He has been the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food since May 2008. He is also a professor at the Catholic University of Louvain and at the College of Europe. He's also a member of the Global Law School faculty at NYU right here in New York and a visiting professor at Columbia. He holds a Master of Laws degree from Harvard University, a diploma cum laude from the International Institute of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and a PhD in law from the University of Louvain. He's been a lecturer in law at the University of Leicester in the UK and has been teaching European Union law, international law, European human rights law, and legal theory at numerous universities, including Paris and Sciences Po in Paris. Mr. De Schutter was also the coordinator of the EU Network of Independent Experts on Fundamental Rights and is the author of several expert reports for the Council of Europe and for the European Union. He served as a Secretary General of the International Federation for Human Rights, and his publications are in the fields of governance and human rights, social and economic rights, and trade and investment law. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor De Schutter.
Well, thank you. I think for this evening, what is most relevant is that I'm a Columbia renegade and that I have a strange European name, and I know that the University in Exile of the New School is a place where I feel perfectly at home. I would like to also thank my friends and intellectual partners, Sakiko Fukuda-Parr, Sanjay Reddy, Nehal Bhuta, for having made this possible. Let me perhaps begin by simply recalling the promise of the UN Charter, which committed states to collaborate for the fulfillment of human rights. And it is this promise that Article 28 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights reiterates when it refers to the right of every person to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in the Declaration can be fully realized. This idea that all states must cooperate to shape an international order that shall allow all human rights to be fulfilled is one that was very much present already in the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 that led to the establishment of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Indeed, at that conference, there was also an agreement on the need for an international trade organization that was negotiated between 1946 and 1948, and that would lead to the Charter of La Havana being adopted in March 1948, which should have succeeded the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, negotiated as a provisional agreement in 1947. The La Havana Charter, establishing the International Trade Organization, would have defined the proper role of international trade as an instrument of economic development rather than as an end in itself. The La Havana Charter included, for example, provisions on the stabilization of commodity prices, the need to combat unemployment, the need for members to avoid measures that could create balance of payments problems for other countries. Now, as we know, the La Havana Charter was ultimately never ratified as a result of the charter being rejected by the US Congress in December 1950. And since then, trade negotiations developed largely apart from the UN system, and international economic relations were shaped largely apart from human rights considerations. The Bretton Woods system is, in that respect, a sort of second-best solution. It is a system in which international trade is promoted as a way to encourage economic growth, and it is expected that at the same time, countries at domestic level shall adopt social policies that will ensure a redistribution of wealth and sustainable types of growth. And this is what John Ruggie calls the embedded liberalism paradigm that was dominant in international relations until recently. This idea has actually failed many developing countries. Developing countries who, when they gained independence in the 1950s and 60s, found that they remained trapped in a colonial pattern of dependence, and that political independence did not result, in fact, in economic sovereignty. And it is in order to answer the concerns of these countries that in 1964 the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development was established in order to promote equitable trade and financing of development. And the UNCTAD had as its leading figure its first Secretary General, Raúl Prebisch, the Argentinian economist, who was one of the major proponents, of course, of the dependency theory developed together with a German economist, Hans Singer. The dependency theory was essentially the idea that there was a relationship between the center and the periphery that was working at the expense of the periphery, the developing countries. It was a theory developed initially within the United Nations Commission on Latin America, the CEPAL, which Raúl Prebisch had been directing after 1948. And the idea was a very simple one. It is that as developing countries produce raw commodities for the international markets and have to import the high-value manufactured products that are produced in rich countries, the terms of trade will be gradually deteriorating, and these developing countries will be trapped in poverty and underdevelopment. And that was what the Uruguayan essayist tried to describe when he said, Eduardo Galeano, when he said that the international division of labor is one in which some countries specialize in winning when other countries specialize in losing. It was this idea that terms of trade mattered and that what you produced was as important as how much you produced and how many exports you managed to send abroad. Now, the 1950s and 1960s were very much dominated by this dependency theory, and a number of countries at the time adopted import substitution policies, forcing industrialization in order to move up the development ladder and diversifying their economies to escape the division of labor that was inherited from the colonial era. This meant huge fiscal costs for these countries, huge inefficiencies leading to high levels of debt, and the results were very contrasted. For some countries, it did succeed. For example, South Korea, Brazil, a handful of other countries. For many others, it failed, and many developing countries did not really manage to industrialize, to climb up the ladder of development, although they did manage to impoverish the countrysides in the name of forced industrialization policies. A new impulse was given to these efforts in the 1970s with the gaining importance of the developing countries in the UN system and the birth of the non-aligned movement, pushing forward the new international economic order and obtaining a number of very important resolutions from the UN General Assembly that was meant to be a blueprint for the restructuration of the international economic system. The new international economic order was the most explicit attempt to reshape international economic relations in accordance with the original promise of the UN Charter and of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and particularly Article 28 of the Declaration. The new international economic order included a commitment to, for example, price supports for commodity exports of developing countries indexed to the rising prices of manufactured products produced by rich countries. It included a commitment to dedicate 0.7% of the rich country's GDP to official development assistance. It included a commitment to redeploy industries in developing countries. It included a commitment to lower tariffs on the exports of manufactured products from developing countries. It included commitments to transfer technologies. And these promises were made 1974, 1975, before being entirely sidelined. And they were sidelined essentially because of two reasons. First, because the General Assembly had no power to effectuate these changes. Developing countries had acquired a majority in the General Assembly, but the General Assembly could only adopt resolutions that had no legally binding effect, and it is to answer this concern that, as UNDP administrator in the 1990s, Mahmoud al-Haq proposed a UN Economic Security Council to overcome the difficulties of decision-making that were undermining this project for the United Nations. But the second and most important reason why the program of the new international economic order failed is because countries were gradually forced to recognize that they would be unable to reimburse their debt unless they accepted the very strong conditions imposed on them under the structural adjustment programs that began being imposed on them in the 1980s. The first one was, in fact, concerning Senegal in 1979. And this macroeconomic jacket imposed on them really, in order to secure the assets of the Western lenders, made it impossible to implement the program of the new international economic order. The dream of the new international economic order came to an end in the 1980s as a result, and the era of neoliberal policies began. The Washington Consensus, as it was described, to qualify this macroeconomic orthodoxy that was being imposed on heavily indebted developing countries, imposed on these countries, for example, to privatize public services and public enterprises, often just to be bought back by northern-based transnational corporations. They imposed a deregulation of the labor market and of prices. They imposed a devaluation of local currencies in order to boost export competitiveness, but at the expense of local purchasing power. They imposed a very significant downsizing of the public sector, and this was at the expense, of course, of health, education, agricultural support, which developing countries are still today paying a very heavy price for. And it meant also creating in developing countries an investment-friendly climate that would remove obstacles to investors coming in and that would lead to increase the protection due to the rights of investors. Now, it is in this context of the 1980s that the Uruguay Round, Uruguay Round for trade negotiations was launched in 1986 that would lead to the establishment of the World Trade Organization in 1994. And the trade rules that we have inherited from the Uruguay Round are really a compromise between the OECD countries on the one hand and a small number of developing countries that are very competitive in agriculture. At the same time, the interests of the low-income countries, although agriculture-based countries, were very much underestimated at the time. These countries were not encouraged by the trade regime to diversify their economies, and when they were not sufficiently competitive in agriculture, they basically could not manage in this system which was shaped for them but without them. Trade liberalization has meant the deepening of the international division of labor, making diversification of economies of developing countries more difficult, and meaning, in fact, that the latecomers in the global markets, those who had not been able to diversify their economies in the 60s and 70s, would be relegated to the production of raw commodities. These countries are unable to protect their nascent industries, they don't have the capital required to invest, and they face obstacles in having access to the technologies that are in the hands of the northern-based transnational corporations. Trade liberalization also meant much more power for transnational corporations in the global trading system, corporations which, for the most part, are very difficult to regulate at state level and play on their ability to purchase from different jurisdictions and invest in different countries depending on the regulatory conditions that they find in these countries. It also meant that the least efficient sectors in developing countries that were unable to support the shock of foreign competition from imports simply were destroyed without any support given to the people depending on these least competitive sectors, which in many cases developing countries were simply unable to support because they don't have the budgetary means required to do so. And so the Bretton Woods system has basically, as I said, been failing these countries. So what was the response? After 20 years of neoliberalism, the response was to push for more money for developing countries in order to address their social needs. Right? The shift from development to poverty reduction described by Sakiko Fukuda-Parr. And the answer was humanitarian in nature. It took the form of the Millennium Development Goals adopted in 2000. Millennium Development Goals, which in fact are popular because they are not threatening. They leave the system unchallenged, and they do so in two ways. First, they are not based on human rights, and they leave entirely aside the question of accountability, both of donor countries and of developing countries, as Philip Alston has very eloquently noted in his publications. The political cost of doing nothing to implement the MDGs is zero. If countries were really serious about the MDGs, they would have adopted national strategies, they would have set up independent monitoring mechanisms to monitor progress done towards fulfilling the MDGs, they would provide remedies for those aggrieved by the lack of progress, but as we all know, they have done none of these things. A second way in which the MDGs are innocuous and actually undermining the development paradigm is that the MDGs do not address the international context, the existing economic arrangements that today enrich the rich and impoverish the poor. Of course, we have MDG 8. MDG 8, which, as you know, concerns the development of a new global partnership for development. But what does this mean, in fact? This MDG 8 is reduced to three targets. One is an increase in the level of ODA, hardly something that changes the rules of the game. Secondly, it means increased access to the markets for developing countries. In other terms, more trade liberalization. But when you are on the wrong path, when you've specialized into raw commodities which will not allow you to climb up the ladder of development, exporting more of these commodities may not be the best way to escape underdevelopment. And the third target under MDG 8 is debt sustainability. But under the heavily indebted poor countries initiative, the countries that qualify for debt relief must meet very specific conditions at various stages. They must show macroeconomic stability, and they must have in place a national poverty reduction plan. Now, these poverty reduction strategy papers, these poverty reduction documents under various names, always require the same things. They require privatization of public utilities, for example, euphemistically called public sector reform. They require deregulation and the removal of subsidies, inter alia those that could benefit the poor. They require the promotion of exports and the promotion of foreign direct investment, and they require trade liberalization. In fact, a study was made recently of 26 poverty reduction strategy papers that were adopted in recent years, showing that all of these PRSPs refer to privatization programs, including in basic services such as water, energy, telecommunications, transport. 23 of them referred to past efforts to liberalize trade, and 11 of them were referring to continuing trade liberalization. So that is the situation in which we are. Embedded liberalism is discredited because it failed to recognize that countries cannot effectively pursue progressive policies at home if the international environment is not reshaped in accordance with their needs. And in fact, there is a recognition that this has been a failure. If you look at the outcome document adopted on the 22nd of September 2010 by the General Assembly of the United Nations on keeping the promise of the MDGs, this document says the following. It says, we recognize that the increasing interdependence of national economies in a globalizing world and the emergence of rules-based regimes for international economic relations have meant that the space for national economic policy, especially in areas of trade, investment, and international development, is now often framed by international disciplines, commitments, and global market considerations. It is for each government to evaluate the trade-off between the benefits of accepting international trade, international rules and commitments, and the constraints posed by the loss of policy space. So there is, in other terms, a recognition very clearly of what might be called the double bind problem. While countries are bound to comply with their human rights obligations at home, many of which correspond to MDGs, they are discouraged from doing so in practice because the international environment has not been transformed to favor this. So what are the solutions? Well, one solution, one alternative, has been put forward by the General Director of the World Trade Organization, Pascal Lamy, in a number of speeches, and he refers to this as the Geneva Consensus. Of course, anxious to dissociate that Geneva Consensus from the 1980s Washington Consensus. The Geneva Consensus is really the idea that international governance is one in which a division of labor should be encouraged between the different international agencies. So while the WTO should focus on trade, the International Labour Organization should promote international labor standards, the World Health Organization support public health policies, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and human rights treaty bodies perhaps push for compliance for human rights. This view, the Geneva Consensus view, is quite popular amongst governments and international agencies because rather than providing an impetus for change, it offers an elegant justification for the status quo. I am deeply suspicious. First of all, this idealized Geneva Consensus does not take into account the very different leverage that each of these various agencies I've referred to can exercise on their member states, although these agencies differ widely between themselves, both in their ability to impose rules and to enforce these rules on the member states. Secondly, the Geneva Consensus underestimates the risks of conflicts between regimes because of the strong overlaps that exist, in fact, between all the different issues that are of international concern. What we need is not more separation, but instead more consistency across policy areas that cannot, in fact, be considered in isolation. And let me give perhaps a couple of examples of this. First, consider the relationship between trade and climate change. We cannot say that trade should be dealt with in Geneva by the WTO when climate change should be dealt with in Bonn under the auspices of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, because there are very important relationships between the two regimes which simply cannot be ignored. For example, while trade may favor the spread of clean technologies, allowing countries to pursue a greener path of growth, at the same time, trade increases economic growth, levels of consumption. This is the scale effect of trade. And we now have many papers that show that this scale effect of trade increasing is far more important than the technology effect of trade disseminating greener technologies. If these studies are correct, it follows that we cannot pretend at the same time to pursue a free trade agenda, leading to the expansion of north-south trade flows and to combat effectively climate change. The development of international trade may be a good thing for economic growth, and it may be a good thing for developing countries who benefit from this, but it is not compatible with effective policies to reduce growth that contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. Or take another example, that of carbon leakage. Right? We have research that shows that 23% of the greenhouse gas emissions linked to goods consumed in rich countries, developed countries, OECD countries, have in fact been emitted elsewhere, in the countries from which rich countries import their goods. This is what is called virtual emissions. Now, the problem with this system is that the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, implementing the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, of course, does not take these virtual emissions into consideration. Only the emissions arising from production or consumption within one country are recorded, so that if the US imports manufactured goods from countries who have not committed to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, this will not be counted. The example of the US is not ideal, of course, but will not be counted in the greenhouse gases emitted by the US. In other terms, industrialized countries, they meet their obligations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change simply by outsourcing the most polluting industries in developing countries, which are not subjected to similar restraints. Now, there are similar examples with respect to the relationship between trade and human rights, which I could describe. In a few days, I shall, for example, publish a note showing how all the policies that developing countries are encouraged to implement for the sake of improved food security are, in fact, policies that are discouraged and sometimes prohibited by the disciplines under the WTO agreements. So the solution cannot be a mere division of labor between institutions because of the reality of overlap between policy areas that cannot, except artificially, be maintained isolated from one another. Now, it does not mean that to overcome this double-bind problem, we simply must overcome what lawyers call the fragmentation of international law, right? This idea that international law has been developing into more and more separated regimes with their own set of rules, their own enforcement of norms and dispute settlement mechanisms, relatively autonomous from one another and from general international law. In fact, we are increasingly seeing more and more efforts to overcome fragmentation thus described. For example, investment treaties today increasingly make it clear that the prohibition of indirect expropriation, regulatory takings, or the guarantee of fair and equitable treatment to the investors shall not be construed as imposing obstacles to the adoption by states of non-discriminatory regulatory actions that seek to protect legitimate public welfare objectives, such as public health, safety, and the environment. Arbitral tribunals may decide that the protection due under investment treaties to investors should not be granted to investments made in violation of the most fundamental rules of protection of human rights, as noted by an ICSID arbitral tribunal in a case concerning the Czech Republic. The appellate body of the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement mechanism has recognized that the WTO agreements must be interpreted to the fullest extent possible so as to be compatible with general international law as well as with the rules that exist between the different parties to a dispute in the interpretation of the trade rules that are at stake in the dispute. And the climate change regime itself has recently acknowledged that we needed to implement adaptation and mitigation strategies taking human rights into account. If you look at what was decided at the 16th session of the Conference of Parties held in Cancun in November and December 2010, they refer to the Resolution 10.4 of the United Nations Human Rights Council on human rights and climate change, and they say that climate change has a range of direct and indirect implications for the effective enjoyment of human rights, and they refer to the fact that this should be taken into account. So we are trying to overcome fragmentation in that sense by building these bridges. But that shall not suffice. First, these are stopgaps that shall not provide a satisfactory answer for situations of real conflict, where conform interpretation is not a solution, it's not an option. Secondly, this does not address the problem of the chilling effect when stipulations in trade or investment agreements discourage states from adopting certain measures, from implementing, in certain respects, human rights, if they do not know whether this would or would not be acceptable to the other parties to a trade or investment agreement, particularly when these trade or investment agreements are vague, indeterminate, and when the requirements imposed on states for the progressive realization of human rights are themselves not entirely clear. It is, and there's a third reason why fragmentation cannot be simply overcome by these bridges, these cross-references from one regime to another, which is that it is one thing to avoid conflicts between regimes. It is quite another to reshape international law in order to allow states to achieve objectives such as human development, the realization of human rights, that we deem paramount. For example, when Christian Barry and Sanjay Reddy discuss how, under certain conditions, they identify with great care a linkage between trade and labor rights could be justified, they are not simply saying that trade law should not stand in the way of countries complying with their obligations to uphold basic labor rights. They do something more. They are saying that the trade regime could serve to enforce compliance with these basic labor standards. They show that access to export markets, while they may not prohibit states from complying with labor standards, may nevertheless encourage states to lower down these standards so that the trade regime must take this much better into account. In other terms, reducing or even eliminating risks of conflicts is not enough. What we must achieve is to change the incentives structure that the states face. How to do this, and at which level should we focus our efforts? There is one very popular view, which is that all that is required is to strengthen democratic processes at home in order to ensure that countries behave in international discussions in a way that reflects their true interests. After all, the main locus of legitimate governance today is at the level of the nation-state, and provided the processes by which each nation determines where its interests lie are sufficiently transparent and allow for well-informed deliberation, we should trust the outcomes of these processes at domestic level. If national negotiators were really held to be accountable before their populations, the argument goes, they would contribute to building regimes that will be the best attuned to the world's needs. We should therefore expect consistency across regimes to be achieved at domestic level, even though this may not be fully achievable at the level of global governance. Essentially, there are three arguments put forward in favor of this view. The first argument is presented very elegantly by Danny Roderick. Danny Roderick notes that in many cases, international regimes have the form of what he calls semi-private goods. Trade is the paradigmatic example. If each country did what was in its selfish interest to do, on the basis of a well-informed and transparent democratic deliberation, each country would abandon policies that reward a narrow constituency within the nation state, the special interests, as they are called in the US, and they would instead adopt trade policies that, because they shall be more open, shall in fact contribute to the global economy. Specializing into whatever one has a comparative advantage in, after all, is in the interest of each country, although it so happens that the international division of labor, according to comparative advantage, is also seen to be in the interest of the global economy itself because it expands the size of the pie. This is a version of the classic idea that private vices result in public virtue, that private and public interests converge. It is, if you wish, the invisible hand writ large. Unfortunately, this argument fails for quite predictable reasons. And let me give two reasons why it fails necessarily. First, Roderick's proposal that we should focus on improving the quality of deliberation at domestic level begs the question of how truly public goods, global public goods, shall be provided at all. If you wish, there is here a two-steps approach in which countries define their national interest first and then seek to conclude, second, an international agreement on the basis of these national interests. There is, in that view, hardly any possibility for global public goods emerging because, per definition, it will always be in the interest of each nation to freely ride on the contributions of others rather than to join in the collective effort. Secondly, the hopes placed in deliberation at national level seem to me to be highly unrealistic. Such choices are never made in a vacuum. They always take into account the constraints of the international context. In fact, the interdependency of countries is such today that many nations in the world may be said to be semi-sovereign only. Their trade, monetary, fiscal, and increasingly social and environmental policies are defined on the basis of policies pursued by other nations, with which they share a global marketplace and the atmosphere. This is not to say that states will systematically prioritize their economic interests in increasing their exports or in attracting investors. They may wish to pay attention also to other values, but we cannot ignore the reality of these incentives that influence deliberations at the domestic level. The need to attract capital, the need to maintain an adequate balance of payments, may not be the sole preoccupation of citizens contributing to defining the national interest, but it would be naive to think that they are not a preoccupation that has an important weight in domestic political processes. Incidentally, this is the reason why the concern that John Rawls expresses in his famous The Law of Peoples contribution is not entirely convincing. John Rawls says that attempts to improve global justice by relying on international institutions necessarily shall result in weakening democratic self-determination at national level, when in fact, in my view, it may do the exact opposite. It may allow people to decide without being hostage to any international environment given once and for all. So let us leave aside the first argument of Danny Roderick, and let's turn to a second argument in favor of this idea that problems of inconsistency in international regimes can be addressed by improving democratic deliberation at the national level. The second argument is a sort of second-best argument, which goes something like this. Because the reshaping of international regimes would be fraught with dangers or too difficult to achieve, we should refocus our efforts on where, after all, we have most chances of achieving some results by building the capacity of national decision-making processes so that they can meaningfully serve to define the state's position in the international arena. The skepticism towards the reshaping of international regimes stems in particular from this idea, for example, put forward by Richard Miller, that these regimes will systematically be captured by the most powerful states, and therefore, says Richard Miller, attributing new powers to institutions linking the strong and the weak is risky because the domineering influence of the top participants may make the new institutional powers further tools for domination in the hands of these powerful actors. However, for all the risks involved in our attempts to reshape global regimes in order to make them more just, I think these risks pale in comparison to those involved in the current status quo. For what do we have at present? We have a general international law that has been gradually developed, largely as the product of the imperial powers' interests, and that is not generally responsive to the needs of the poorest countries. General international law, in fact, systematically favors the states that have the largest economies and the most power in international relations. It is these states whose interests will be considered paramount in the formation of new rules. It is these states also which are best equipped to enforce the rules of international law in the self-enforced type of enforcement that international law still depends on for its effectiveness. And if we move away from general international law to the conclusion of separate treaties, that is not a solution either. In fact, as clearly illustrated by the case of investment treaties, the smaller a country's economy is, the weaker the bargaining position of that country in trade negotiations or investment negotiations that shall define the respective rights and obligations of the parties. As noted by Christian Barry under the explicit heading referring to the unattractive alternative, bilateral bullying, a world without global institutions or with only weakened institutions is not an attractive prospect. Powerful countries will do their very best to divide and rule weaker and poor countries, bullying them in ways that could be difficult to resist unless these countries act collectively. So there is a third argument in favor of shifting our efforts to local or national decision-making instead of trying to reshape the global institutions. And that is the idea that we would be lacking at global level one convincing metric allowing us to judge the equity of existing arrangements, simply because different societies have very different views about the requirements of substantive justice and even of procedural fairness. Now, I'm an unreconstructed universalist, and I believe that we do have such a global metric. And these are universally recognized human rights. In fact, I believe that our best chance may be to move human rights beyond the position they now occupy as rights that regulate the relationships between a state and its population, to what in fact is the position that human rights were occupying when the United Nations were invented, the position of a lodestar, defining the objective that all international regimes should contribute to fulfilling. For the reasons I've just indicated, the status quo is simply untenable for poor countries. International law has been developing without them and largely against them, and the current international regimes are not sufficiently supportive of their efforts to improve their condition. The opportunity here is that interdependency, in fact, is mutual, and the status quo is also untenable for rich countries. The new fears of today, from failed states where transnational crime can operate from, to climate change, from the dwindling of natural resources to unfair competition from jurisdictions with lax social and environmental standards, all these fears can only be addressed by more international cooperation and not by unilateral action. In fact, the rich countries have collectively a considerable interest in reducing poverty in developing countries. This will reduce population growth and the resulting pressure on natural resources. This will mean growing markets for their exports. It will mean improved governance at national level and therefore a stronger ability to tackle international crime. It will mean also reducing the temptation for poor countries to seek their competitive advantage on global markets in low standards and low wages rather than in the production of services or goods that allow them to diversify their economies. But while the promotion of development is in the collective interest of rich countries, no individual rich country has an interest in working towards this alone. It is cheaper, it is easier, simply to write freely on the efforts of others. Human development objectives and human rights, in my view, are quintessentially global public goods, and we must draw the institutional consequences from this fact. As Christian Barry noted elsewhere, we must accept the duty of global institutional reform. How to do this? Well, I would like to present something I like to call the Rome model to describe this proposal. I believe that, as noted by Susan Randolph, reshaping international regimes so that they converge towards the full realization of human rights corresponds, in fact, to what is required by the right to development. very nicely summarized by Sakiko Fukuda-Parr. Now, just like Sakiko earlier on, I feel humbled to speak here in presence of Philip Alston, which was one of the two fathers of the right to development, very progressive couple, I suppose. The other being Keba Mbaye. Philip Alston, in 1978, prepared a 161-long study then presented by the UN Secretary General on what the right to development consisted in, and we are still indebted towards this work. I'm not going to go through all the independent experts' work and the various task forces that have been established. I don't think we have to abandon the vision of the right to development, but I do think we must redefine how to get there. And that is why I'd like to present this as the role model. And I would like to say that this model should have three components. First, there is the substantive component, the reference to human rights and the use of human rights-based indicators to measure progress done both at national and at international level. Second, there is the institutional component, the establishment of fora where all relevant actors could ensure coordination and ensure that policies they adopt converge towards the full realization of human rights. And third, there is the governance component, the adoption of action plans that ensure that we make progress at reasonable speed towards that objective. So first, the substantive component. We need to reestablish human rights as the reference through which we measure progress at national and international levels. This means relying on human rights indicators rather than, for example, on macroeconomic indicators or on development indicators alone. Now, to a large extent, this is already what human rights treaty bodies do, what human rights experts do, and this, therefore, should be achievable. Where more needs to be done, however, is in effectuating this position shift I've referred to earlier from human rights imposing duties on states towards their population to human rights reshaping international regimes. And this means asking, which human rights duties can be imposed on international organizations, both within and outside the UN system, and how can we develop mechanisms that can hold these organizations accountable? It means developing tools to ensure that transnational corporations are aware of their human rights responsibilities. It means ensuring that states comply not only with their human rights obligations towards individuals and groups within their territory, but also comply with their extraterritorial human rights obligations. Now, over the past 10 years, very significant progress has been done in this respect. International organizations are increasingly developing mechanisms to ensure that they are accountable towards human rights. Transnational corporations have been made aware that they are now expected to respect human rights and have a positive impact on their realization. In her excellent presentation, although slightly self-effacing, because Margaret Solomon was one of the authors of these Maastricht principles on the extraterritorial obligations of states in the area of economic, social, and cultural rights, Margaret Solomon presented the Maastricht principles that indeed impose or describe how human rights law imposes on states extraterritorial obligations beyond their national territories. Although I believe that the Maastricht principles should be further made further operational by giving very practical tools to states as to how to move in this direction, we are making progress. And as these norms and procedures develop that shift the position that human rights occupy, human rights gradually are becoming this global metric, this global public standard, to borrow terms from Buchanan and Cohen, that allows us to assess the normative legitimacy of global governance institutions. Even apart the preeminent position that human rights occupy in the original project of the United Nations, I believe that human rights possess three features that make them particularly suitable to perform this goal or this task. First, human rights, as Philip Alston reminded us, are relatively incomplete. They are sufficiently precise to provide a focal point for deliberations as to how to build international regimes, for example, how to regulate trade, how much to protect foreign investors, how to allocate responsibilities in combating climate change, yet they are vague enough not to preempt the results of these deliberations. So in that sense, they allow for ownership by the actors, primarily the states, who shall contribute to the establishment of these international regimes. As Buchanan and Cohen note, any standard of legitimacy at global level should allow for principled, informed deliberation about moral issues into the standard of legitimacy itself. And I believe that this is exactly what human rights do, at least as well as other potential candidates, such as sustainable developments, green growth, or development goals. A second advantage of human rights is that they have two faces. They are, on the one hand, legal rules binding upon states, but they are also ideals. The legitimacy that human rights confer includes the element of legality without being reducible to that element. Human rights are violated or they are complied with in this simplifying language that human rights lawyers usually use, but this does not exhaust their significance. Human rights can always be improved upon. Our quest for the full realization of human rights is one in which we permanently learn, in which we permanently test the means we use against the ends that human rights are supposed to define. A third advantage of human rights is that they effectively correspond to the requirements of what political philosophers called moral cosmopolitanism. This idea that citizens in rich countries owe duties to citizens in poor countries. As Thomas Pogge writes, every human being has a global stature as the ultimate unit of moral concern. And that is precisely what human rights are about, of course. Human rights are held by each individual, wherever she finds herself to be, and all states are duty-bound to refrain from conduct that might lead to violating the rights of that individual. Because they can ground an obligation to support each individual's access to certain basic needs, a condition for the effective enjoyment of human rights can provide this foundation for a duty for states to work collaboratively towards fulfilling these needs. So that was the substantive component. Second, the institutional component, in my view, should consist in creating fora where different international actors, governments, international agencies, networks of civil society organizations, can work together to ensure that their policies converge rather than risking undermining each other's efforts. Now, this is precisely what is done for the right to food, and this is why I call this the Rome model. Following the global food price crisis of 2007-2008, a new body was established, or rather, a body was significantly transformed to ensure precisely this cooperation, this coherence across various actors. And this body is the Committee on World Food Security that meets in Rome. The Committee on World Food Security was transformed at the end of 2009 in order to become, in the words of the founding document, the foremost inclusive, international and intergovernmental platform to combat hunger and malnutrition and to realize the right to food for all. The members of the CFS, the Committee on World Food Security, are governments from the North and the South, the UN agencies and non-UN organizations, such as the World Trade Organization, civil society organizations, farmers' organizations, and the private sector, which also takes part in these deliberations. This committee, the CFS, is expected to provide a platform for discussion and coordination to strengthen collaborative action across participants. It is established to ensure greater policy convergence and coordination. It is established to provide support and advice to countries and regions. And in the second phase of its existence, which we are now entering, the CFS, this Committee on World Food Security, should promote accountability by the definition of common indicators to monitor progress towards agreed-upon objectives and actions, and it should, finally, develop a global strategic framework for food security and nutrition conceived as a flexible rolling document, regularly updated, that defines what countries, agencies have to do in order to move towards the full eradication of hunger and malnutrition. Collective learning, monitoring for results, accountability are therefore built into the work of the CFS. So that was the second component, the institutional component. The third component is the governance component. And here my argument is that we should also adopt comprehensive strategies to ensure that international regimes are gradually reshaped in accordance to human rights requirements. And these strategies should take the form of action plans defining very precisely which measures should be adopted, by whom, within which time frame. And we should do this to overcome the vagueness of human rights when it comes to defining the duties of states and others to cooperate. This is what this global strategic framework for food security and nutrition should achieve within the context of the CFS. The reason why this matters is because what is needed is much more than just an ad hoc reaction to discrete human rights violations by specific measures. What is needed is a sustained effort towards a transition. We need to channel existing regimes towards a direction that is better conducive to the full realization of human rights. Action plans are there precisely to overcome the gap between the what we need to do, and the how, the steps that we have to take in order to move towards fulfilling that vision. They bridge the gap, these action plans, between relatively small changes to the system that, taken in isolation, may be unable to make a significant difference, and changes, on the other hand, so broad, so utopian, that they may seem impossible to achieve. Action plans, in other terms, are the way to overcome the gap between reform and revolution. For such action plans, global strategies to succeed, they should include appropriate indicators and benchmarks. They should include a monitoring of the choices made by policymakers. And this can constitute a very powerful incentive to integrate long-term considerations into decision-making and to effectively implement whichever roadmap can be agreed upon in these fora, which the CFS provides a blueprint for. It's always tempting, of course, for the proponents of business as usual to dismiss utopian proposals as so far-reaching that they seem to be revolutionary in nature, and at the same time to dismiss proposals that are so minor and insignificant that they seem not to make any difference at all. We must move beyond this false opposition, I believe. What matters is not each of the policy proposals considered in isolation, whether reformist or more revolutionary in nature. It is the pathway that matters, the sequence of measures that, step by step, may lead gradually to move beyond the existing fragmentation of international law and of global governance. Let me conclude. When human rights initially were made part of international law, they were seen as introducing a Copernican revolution. For the first time, through human rights, international law was regulating relationships between the state and its population, that hitherto had been largely shielded from international scrutiny. We now need a second Copernican revolution in the three directions that I've indicated. First, to make it possible for human rights to guide the exercise of their powers by international organizations. Second, to ensure that transnational corporations use their influence to support human rights. And third, to monitor the impacts that measures adopted by states have outside their national territory. We also need to develop new forms of coordination at international level that the specialization of international regimes and organizations have discouraged in the architecture inherited from the Bretton Woods era. It is not enough to mitigate the negative impacts of fragmentation, we must move towards improved convergence, alignment on a same agenda. And finally, we must be impatient with the status quo. Guarding against violations of human rights in the global economy will not do. We must plan a transition and gradually change the structure itself, piece by piece. So, my friends, this sounds utopian, I know, but I would like to keep in mind what Eduardo Galeano, again, said about the virtues of utopia. Utopia, he says, lies at the horizon. When I draw nearer by 2 steps, it retreats 2 steps. If I proceed 10 steps forward, it swiftly slips 10 steps ahead. No matter how far I go, I can never reach it. And so Galeano asks, what then is the purpose of utopia? And his answer is, it is a cause for us to advance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivier. We have 2 microphones down in front, and so I want to make this largely about questions from the audience, if people have them. So if you have a question, just please come on down. I'm going to ask you to state your name and affiliation, and then go ahead with the question. But while we're waiting for them all to come down, okay, I was quite pleased. First of all, your lecture provides us a lot of food for thought, and you covered many, many different areas. I started taking notes, and I realized that there was so much more coming that I couldn't possibly keep all my notes down. But I do think it's at the end, when you talked about this being a visionary thing, I think you're right, and I take the words about utopianism. In fact, it reminded me a little bit, about a month ago, we had former Prime Minister Gordon Brown here, who had a very similar argument in terms of the need for global institutions or almost global government in order to solve our problems. And the question that came from the audience and from me when I was sitting up here with him as well was, how do we get from here to there? Okay, and I know you've admitted that's an issue for your vision, but I'd like to point out one thing in the speech. This may be too nitpicking about it, but you referred to the idea of strengthening democratic structures as a way, some people propose as a way to solve some of these problems. At the same time, you're very critical of that because you felt that it ignored some very basic collective action problems, if I can put a gloss on it, both internal to the governments and also for global public goods. Yeah, I see nothing in your vision that solves that collective action problem. I could think of one, possible, and actually I think this is the truth, because I'm sort of a utopian universalist myself. I think there's been a gradual cultural movement, particularly in the area of human rights, that I've seen over my lifetime of more sensitivity to particularly cross-border rights. They've tended to be first in the political areas, but they're growing in different areas. And so as people get adjusted to thinking the way you're talking about, that's true. But that's a very long process. And the institutions you talk about will only come about, at least on this view, when the cultural norms change about the way we look at things. So I just thought maybe I'd give you a chance to address what I actually saw as a bit of an inconsistency in. You're very critical of one approach, but then you don't really handle the same problem with your approach.
No, so first of all, I'm very myself very in favor of democratic processes, and I think they must be strengthened at domestic level. Certainly, I simply made the point that they would not allow countries to overcome the double bind in which they find themselves, right? In which they would like to do much more, supposedly, to promote human rights at home, but are constrained by the international environment in which they are plunged. And however perfect democracy is at national level, it will not be sufficient to address this, because the choices of people will be predetermined by the constraints that the international system imposes on them. And so this is why I believe we need not a global democracy, because that is really very difficult. Yeah, well, really utopian, but maybe not even desirable, because democracy only functions if it's backed up by a sort of common ethos and a public sphere, so that people feel that they are sharing a same destiny, if you wish, which I'm not sure is easy to achieve at global level. But I certainly do think that we need to overcome collective action problems at global level by obliging governments and international agencies to explicitly address the problems resulting from the silo approach to global issues that we have adopted up to now. So, yes, the World Trade Organization should come at the table that is occupied also by the International Fund for Agricultural Development, by the Food and Agriculture Organization, and by the least developed countries who complain that the trade regime is not allowing them to rebuild and indeed strengthen their agriculture at home. Unless we have such a forum where all these agencies work towards the realization of certain agreed upon objectives, and until we arrive at this moment, we will not be able to overcome the current gaps in the system that simple cross-references and a sort of neat division of labor between different regimes shall not suffice to overcome, in my view. So I'm in favor of local democracy. I'm in favor of the ILO having more tools at its disposal and so on, but I don't think that that will be sufficient, and we need to have these different regimes work together instead of simply referring to one another. And that was essentially what I tried to propose, based on what is not so utopian after all, which is what is done in the Committee on World Food Security since a couple of years now. What we needed to achieve this was a very significant crisis that drew 140 million people more into extreme poverty, and that led humanity for the first time to pass the mark of 1 billion hungry people on Earth. So it was a significant crisis, leading to countries and agencies realizing that the current system simply could not continue as it did. But I do think that what came out from the crisis is something we can build upon to strengthen our reflection.
Good. Well?
Lisa DiCaprio, New York University. I have a question about how climate change, human rights, and trade policies are linked, and if you could expand on that. In terms of the carbon footprint, you had mentioned globalization, of course, creates a larger carbon footprint than local economies, local trade. Could you expand on that in terms of, for example, city procurement policies? How can we reconsider the concept of what is a fair price for a city to pay for any kind of supplies? If we include the carbon footprint, of course, the price is much larger, but no city that I know, municipality or state government, incorporates a carbon footprint into its procurement policies. This, of course, would also apply to institutions like universities.
Right. Well, my argument was really not about miles traveled by goods that are shipped to faraway destinations. My argument was that the lack of coordination between trade and climate change, or the trade and climate change regimes, leads to very significant inconsistencies, right? And you know, if you take, for example, the EU exports goods, imports goods, and the carbon content of what it imports is about double the carbon content of what it exports. So the EU member states are very proud that they comply with their commitments under the Kyoto Protocol, and that they reduce, well, they don't reduce, but they decelerate their emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. But in fact, they do so simply because they outsource the most polluting industries, and they then buy those goods that have been produced in these faraway locations, which are not bound by any commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So basically, the more we promote trade liberalization, the easiest it becomes for rich countries to comply with their very sanctified commitments under the climate change regime. And I think that is typically the kind of inconsistency which we must be aware of, and which is a recipe for failing in our desperate efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you. It was quite interesting talk. Hold on, let me see if I can get this back up.
Just your name and your...
Hi, yes. So I'm Tara Lawson-Reamer. I'm on faculty here. And I've just spent a year working at the U.S. Treasury Department. So I want to bring a little bit of that to bear as well on my question. So I have two questions for you. The first is just, you know, I think the sketch that you presented was one of divergent interests between developed and developing countries. And I think it would be useful to unpack a little bit a divergent interest between elites and others within countries, that oftentimes I think you have a congruence of interest between global elites, and that the divergence is really often within countries as opposed to just between countries, and how that impacts these dynamics of negotiation and contestation internationally. But the second issue I wanted to raise and ask you to address a little bit is, you presented, and I think quite rightly, the framework that the silos in which global governance exists has the effect of marginalizing human rights, because fundamentally the rules of the game, as you called them, are set in what I would call finance channels. So trade negotiations, you know, IMF, Article 4 consultations, etc. However, it's not clear to me that you can overcome those silos by asking the actors to create a plan. Because if you take your first point seriously, that it's these power dynamics that matter, then what is it that about creating a construct or a plan that's going to get these various actors to agree to a new set of norms or a new set of objectives that they wouldn't agree to already, in their existing silo? So in other words, to tear down those walls doesn't necessarily mean that normative framework that you're advocating becomes the one that is driving agendas. So that, I guess I would push back a little bit there. I would say that it's hard for me to imagine that those rules of the game that are fundamentally set in the finance space then become driven by human rights norms.
Okay, so beginning with your second question, I believe that maybe you just identified a fourth argument in favor of why human rights can be this global standard, which is that nobody dares say he or she is against them. So all pay rhetorical, at least, tribute to human rights, and all actors pretend that some way or another they're conspiring towards fulfilling them. There was one letter by, at the time, Louise Arbour, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to Pascal Lamy, asking whether the World Trade Organization wanted to contribute to the Universal Periodic Review, which is the process that all members of the United Nations are subjected to within the Human Rights Council, reviewing their human rights achievements or lack thereof. And this is a relatively open process in which many people can contribute. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights synthesizing the contributions for this Universal Periodic Review. And Pascal Lamy answered a letter which was 3 lines, 2 sentences, basically saying the World Trade Organization works for more trade liberalization, and I'm not even sure there were 2 sentences, and this contributes to economic growth and thus to the fulfillment of human rights. That was it. And that was the contribution of the World Trade Organization to human rights. But he did not challenge that they were to be guided by this lodestar, right? If you look at the speeches of Pascal Lamy, he says the World Trade Organization is bound by human rights, although he does have a quite different view of what this implies than some others would have. But there is there are very few, I think, I mean, beyond the platitudes of sustainable development and green growth, there are very few ideals that have this very same weight in global governance and that can serve this very same function. There is a convening power to human rights, which we must be aware of if we work towards reconciling the global economy with human rights. It's a very powerful tool, I believe, at our disposal. Secondly, yes, of course, we must urgently, when we discuss these issues related to human development, human rights, open up the black box of the state and identify within the states very different interests and very different relationships to economic globalization. Very clearly, globalization has been benefiting some and not benefiting others in many countries, and the vast majority of developing countries have not been able to put in place a social security, social protection system allowing resources to be transferred from the winners to the losers. And when we enter into international negotiations, we must be aware that in many cases, countries are represented by governments who are very heavily influenced by the interests of their elites rather than by the interests of their peoples. But there again, there's a fiction we may play with by asking them to justify the positions they take in the light of those most vulnerable and those who need most their situation to improve. But what you say is quite right. And for example, in the trade negotiations within the WTO, on 2 occasions only was the right to food invoked by countries negotiating on which schedules of commitments they would agree to in the area of agriculture. One country was Mauritius, for some reason. They one day invoked the right to food, and they therefore could not make this concession because their small farmers would be negatively impacted. I don't know why. Maybe they had hired some NGO person. And the other was Norway. For some reason, Norway invoked the right to food in order, again, to refuse one concession that was requested from them. And that's all. And my argument is they should use this much more to strengthen their bargaining position and to avoid being bullied into making concessions when this would be detrimental to their ability to comply with their human rights obligations. They resist doing so because we still are victims of a situation in which human rights were perceived by developing countries as conditionalities when they were linked to trade or investment considerations. And I think we now must move beyond that fear.
I'm intrigued. What was Norway's concern? Was it whaling?
The fishing resources.
Fishing resources, yeah. Okay. Please.
Hello. I work for an international labor standards organization, Social Accountability International. I'm also a student here at Millennium. I just had a pretty simple question.
Your name, please. Come on.
Oh, Jolene. My name is Jolene. My simple question is, what is your opinion or assessment about John Ruggie's guiding principles for human rights in addressing that issue that you mentioned of fragmentation? Just wondering. That's my question.
Well, everybody, and maybe you included, would like a very short, snappy answer, quotable at best. It's actually quite complicated. I think the diagnosis is quite right. That is a mere transposition of what was done with respect to states to private actors will not work and will may be alienating these corporations from espousing human rights considerations in their work. It seems to me that the way that he has approached this was, in that sense, based on a right diagnosis that the earlier efforts had been antagonizing and that it was not fruitful to continue along that road. So what he did was very, I think, smart, strategically speaking, removing the norms on human rights and transnational corporations and other business enterprises that the Subcommission on Human Rights of the then Human Rights Commission had presented. And he wanted to begin on a blank slate, convening all different actors to various consultations so that the principles ultimately can be said to be based on a very wide range of views being taken into account, right? So I think he managed this to build legitimacy for the process quite remarkably well. He does point at policy inconsistencies, showing how governments, on the one hand, must protect human rights against the acts of transnational corporations, but then create many escape routes or many incentives for these corporations not to behave adequately, and they are not reconciling what they're doing in the areas of trade investment with what they should do in the area of human rights. And that, again, was, I think, very, very well done. I think what is missing is perhaps the operational dimension, right? How can we move from this diagnosis and this, I think, quite lucid analysis to improving the situation on the ground? And I believe that the best way to do this is to have a monitoring process continue to identify how these guiding principles, which have the advantage of having been endorsed by the Human Rights Council, so they have a very strong legitimacy, can be actually implemented. If there's no monitoring of how these principles are implemented, in a few years' time, they will be essentially forgotten. So we need some forum, some experts, some body to basically ensure that states move towards implementing these principles, that corporations do what they should do, which is to respect human rights and provide grievance mechanisms and so on, because otherwise this will lead nowhere. Personally, I'm in favor of a new special procedure of the Human Rights Council to monitor the behavior of transnational corporations. Usually the standard answer to this is, well, there are 65,000 transnational corporations in the world. How on earth can you monitor them? But the answer is, you don't have to ask each of them to produce reports and read this. It's simply enough to provide one place, one procedure by which victims can complain against the way transnational corporations have been doing business. And this will allow this forum, this expert, this special procedure to develop a better understanding of what these principles say. And I think they need to be fleshed out in greater detail in the future.
I think we have time for one more question. Please.
So, hi, I'm Teresa Eggers, and I'm an undergraduate student in global studies at the New School for Public Engagement. So maybe you were beginning to touch on an answer to this question right now, but I was wondering, you were talking a lot about the need for accountability, which I think is very important to actually affecting the kinds of any sort of progressive plan we talk about. And I was wondering what you think can be possibilities for how to balance accountability with state preferences to maintain sovereignty, and just basically how we can achieve accountability, and also how you achieve accountability of governments, basically, without risking negative effects on populations in those states.
Well, I don't see the second part of your question. I don't see what you're alluding to in terms of a contradiction between accountability of governments and the consequences for the population under their jurisdiction. I think they go hand in hand, on the contrary.
Oh, I mean in terms of...
We could all hear it, yeah.
I mean in terms of taking away initial economic incentives, for example, for a government, or trade sanctions, anything that would basically punish a government, how you punish governments, as in holding them accountable without actually holding their populations accountable.
Right. Okay, well, I guess, yes, accountability is key because it shall increase the political cost of not moving fast enough in the right direction. And I think it can only succeed, these attempts to improve the role that human rights are playing in the global economy, by ensuring that governments feel a pressure from the bottom up, right? So, again, referring to what Philip Olsen was saying, this sort of tension between a top-down, expert, technocratic approach to human rights, and on the other hand, the bottom-up approach, social movements using human rights as a tool to bring about social transformation, I think the two are very complementary. And we will not succeed in having governments shamed into action unless accountability is established, which means an obligation for governments to measure progress, an obligation for them to report back, and a possibility for civil society, for media to demand from governments that they do as they promise and that they move swiftly enough in realizing human rights. And that is what accountability is meant to achieve. I also think that accountability is not simply having to remedy one particular action you've taken that has a negative impact on human rights, or having to justify not taking action in certain cases, which you could have, where you could have improved the situation of a rights holder. It also means accountability in making progress and in making a transition towards more just systems. And this is what national strategies for the realization of human rights are meant to do. They are a governance tool that basically teach us that even though some rights are subject to progressive realization, they nevertheless may be subject to accountability mechanisms if governments decide what they're going to do to move towards the full realization of human rights, in which case they may be held accountable for complying or not complying with the roadmap that they have chosen for themselves. So it is in this second sense, especially, that I insisted on the need for more accountability. Now, your second question, or the second half of your question, presupposed that countries not doing enough would be subjected to economic sanctions that could have a negative impact on the population, and that we would be taking the population in hostage in order to force governments to do things better. I do not think that this is really how human rights can make progress. There are many incentives that governments may be imposed to move towards greater fulfillment of human rights. Economic sanctions are probably not the best way to do this, except under very narrowly defined conditions. But certainly, the pressure that they shall be subjected to by these peer review processes organized at global level, this idea that they are together with other governments trying to move in the fulfillment of a calendar of actions, the reward they shall have in international fora in improving their standing by being the best in class are things that can work. And I know how bizarre this sounds for a human rights lawyer to say, indicators and ratings and so on. But there is a real accountability if governments have to report as to the progress that they are doing, and if they are watched by all the other governments, particularly if this is looking at how much they are doing to implement one common agenda for action. So that is, at the very least, what human rights should be able to achieve.
I think we should end there, but thank you very much for the wonderful lecture and answering our questions.